Hey folks, Oisín here from the Troubles podcast. Just before we get into this episode, I want to say thank you to everyone for listening to this series. So far, the feedback has been great, and many of you have found this series to be a solid introduction to quite a dense period of history, which is exactly what I intended it to be. The original plan was to make 10 episodes and then take a break. From start to finish, each episode takes about 2 weeks to research, write, produce, edit and publish, and it's quite time consuming and difficult to commit to full time when I need to work as well. That's why I've started a Patreon account. If you have been enjoying this podcast and find yourself in a position to donate the price of a coffee or pint, it would really help to offset the cost of making this series. It will also allow me to have more time to focus on writing and producing episodes. As it stands, I have ideas for at least 50 more episodes, and your help will mean I'll be able to keep on producing them at a steady rate. Without it, I'd probably have to pause the podcast. You can support me at patreon.com/The Troubles Podcast. So thanks again. Now back to the episode. It was a Saturday afternoon in the Northern Irish town of Omagh. With just 2 weeks before school was due to start, many parents were out with their children getting school uniforms. A red Vauxhall was parked in the centre of the town. Inside the car were 2 men and a £500 bomb. The men armed the bomb and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. What happened next would become the single deadliest bombing atrocity of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. This is the Troubles podcast, a podcast which explores the violence and bloodshed that occurred in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and Great Britain, as multiple sides and organisations waged a conflict over the status of Northern Ireland. A quick note before we begin, that this podcast deals with some graphic subject matter which may not be suitable for a younger audience. 1998 was a turning point for the Troubles in Northern Ireland. After 30 years of violence and tit-for-tat killings that never seemed to end, enough was enough. In 1997, the Irish and British governments signed the Mitchell Principles, which was a commitment for them to focus on resolving political issues in a peaceful means. The Provisional IRA also declared a ceasefire, but many of their members saw this as a betrayal of the Republican struggle. Some of these members broke off from the Provisional IRA and formed the Real IRA. The Real IRA reject the Mitchell Principles and the Good Friday Agreement, and oppose any political settlement that falls short of Irish unity and independence. The Real IRA focused their bombing campaign on town centres so that they would damage the economic infrastructure of Northern Ireland. Like the Provisional IRA before them, they wanted to damage the economy of the towns and limit civilian casualties. They attempted to do this by calling the police before a bomb was due to go off and saying a code word so authorities knew that there was a genuine threat. But this was not always a successful way of limiting civilian casualties, as was the case in Omagh. 2 days before the bombing, on the 13th of August 1998, a red Vauxhall car was stolen in the Irish town of Carrickmacross in Monaghan. Carrickmacross is only a short distance from the Northern Irish border. The number plates on the car were changed from Irish to Northern Irish plates, and the car was loaded with a £500 fertiliser bomb. Then, on the 15th of August, the car was driven across the border into Northern Ireland. A scout car went ahead, which would warn the driver of the Vauxhall if there were any police checkpoints up ahead. The drivers of both cars communicated with each other via mobile phone. The car was driven into the town centre of Omagh and then parked there at 19 minutes past 2. It was a busy Saturday afternoon. Many people were in town to do their weekly shopping. The drivers had intended to park the car outside the courthouse but couldn't find parking, so parked it on Market Street on the eastern edge of the town centre. This would be a crucial factor in the sheer amount of casualties that would occur on this day. The men set the timer on the bomb to 40 minutes and then got into the scout car and fled the scene. During this time, a chilling photo was captured of a man and a child standing beside the red Vauxhall. The two survived, but the individual who took the photo died in the bombing. At 2:30, 3 phone calls were then placed. One was placed to Ulster Television, where the caller said, "There's a bomb, courthouse, Omagh, Main Street. £500, explosion, 30 minutes. Ulster Television then received a second call saying that the bomb was due to go off in 15 minutes. The final call went out to the Samaritans in Coleraine, which said that a bomb would go off about 200 yards from the main street in Omagh. All 3 calls used the code word that had been used during the Banbridge bombing just 2 weeks ago. The code word was Martha Pope. The RUC were then alerted and immediately started evacuating the area surrounding the courthouse. There were a few problems though. The main one was that there was no main street in Omagh, though Market Street was the town's main shopping area. Believing the bomb to be close to the courthouse, they evacuated the surrounding areas and moved people away from the courthouse and into the blast zone of the bomb. Instead of the bomb being about 200 yards, or 180 metres from the courthouse, it was actually placed 365 yards, or 334 metres away from the courthouse, so authorities believed that they were evacuating people to a safe distance. At 3:10, 50 minutes after the car bomb was parked, the bomb detonated in the crowded area where the civilians had been evacuated to. The noise of the explosion was captured in the background of a police dispatch.
Blue 3, Oscar 17. Blue 3, Oscar 17, Blue 3, send over. Roger, could you...
The explosion caused absolute devastation. The car which the bomb was placed in was blasted into pieces of shrapnel that was found hundreds of yards away. The roof was blown off some of the buildings, and shop fronts up and down the street were destroyed. The force of the blast tore up concrete on the street and burst water pipes underneath, which caused water to run down the street, red with the blood of the injured. 21 people died in the initial blast, with 8 more to die on their way to the hospital. Captain Sam Potter of the Royal Army Medical Corps described the scene. There were bodies scattered all over the street. Many had been covered. There were body parts, pieces of brain, pieces of arms, pieces of legs. There was a torrent of water flowing down the street. There were electrical cables sparking. There were roof slates falling on the road nearby. It was a scene from hell. Jolene Jameson, who worked nearby, described what she saw. I was in the kitchen and heard a big bang. Everything fell on me. The cupboards blew off the wall. The next thing, I got blasted out into the street. There was smashed glass everywhere. Bodies, children, people were inside out. Within minutes, Northern Ireland's largest ever medical emergency operation was underway. Over 200 people needed treatment and the nearby hospitals were completely overwhelmed. Dr. Dominic Pinto was the first surgeon to arrive at Tyrone County Hospital and described the scene that met him. When I came to the front of the hospital, it was absolutely quiet. What greeted me when I got into the main corridor was sheer pandemonium. This was not a major incident, but a major disaster of battlefield proportions. There were people lying in the corridors of the accident and emergency department, overflowing into the radiology department. Some 240 injured people arrived within the first 45 minutes. Buses, cars and helicopters were used to take the injured to a number of nearby hospitals. Firemen and the army spent the next 7 hours using thermal imaging technology, digging through rubble trying to find survivors. Some rescue workers compared the scene to that of a battlefield. One ambulance worker described the victims, saying, "The injuries are horrific, from amputees to severe head injuries to serious burns, and among them are women and children." Blankets from a nearby drapery shop were used to cover the dead, and the Omagh Leisure Centre was used as a crisis centre where relatives and families could learn news about what was happening. Of the 29 people killed, 16 were Catholic and 11 were Protestant. 2 Spanish tourists were also killed in the blast, as well as many children and teenagers. Most of the victims were women, and in one case, 3 generations of the same family were all killed. They were Mary Grimes, her daughter Avril Monaghan, and Avril's 18-month-old baby Maura. Avril was also pregnant with twins at the time of her death. The local subdivision commander of the police spoke out at the end of the day. Quote, "What chance have any of us got when we are told that the bomb is at a courthouse, when the actual target is the ordinary townspeople in a busy shopping area hundreds of yards away? There can be no ifs or buts about this. There are no so-called legitimate targets. There can be no excuse whatever for putting the lives of hundreds of people at risk. Such people serve no cause but that of murder and mayhem. With the help of decent people of Northern Ireland, we will do everything in our power to ensure those responsible for this outrage are brought to justice." Marion Radford, who lost her son Alan in the blast, said, "Well, I didn't see my son until they brought him home in a coffin, and I thought this can't be my son coming through this door. But I remember the shrapnel wounds over the face. I didn't see his body. I think Alan was all in one piece as far as I know, which is something. That maybe other families didn't even get to see their loved ones." Kevin Skelton, who lost his wife Philomena in the blast, said, "The chat about Catholic and Protestant. Blood is all the one colour running down the street. And for what? Absolutely nothing." The initial reactions of the blast were of shock and horror. The Irish, Northern Irish and British governments had all been working to make peace after 30 years of turmoil, and this attack shocked everyone. In the way that Bloody Sunday can be seen as a catalyst for the start of the Troubles, the Omagh bombing was a sort of end. The killing was senseless and killed both Protestants and Catholics indiscriminately, and many turned to the peace process as a means to an end to this kind of violence. The BBC reported, "Like other bombings in the early part of 1998, in places like Lisburn and Banbridge, Omagh was a conscious attempt by Republicans who disagreed with the political strategy of Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness to destabilise Northern Ireland in that vulnerable moment of hope. It failed, but there is a terrible irony to the way in which the campaign was halted, only by the wave of revulsion triggered by the carnage at Omagh." Gwen Hall, whose son was maimed in the attacks, wrote an open letter to the real IRA from her hospital bed that read, "To the bold lads who ripped out the heart of Omagh, I will probably never know who you are, but you know. I'll tell you who I am. My name is Gwen. I am the mother of Alastair, who is the bravest person I know. We and all the other victims of your ambush last Saturday would like to know why. I went to hell and back, lying injured in the debris and the water and blood, not knowing if my 12-year-old son was alive or dead. By God's grace, he survived, and that is why I am lying here, able to write. I wish you could have heard that child crying inconsolably yesterday as he struggled with the pain from his severed limb. That was what ripped at my heart. However, we are 2 of the lucky ones, for which I thank God. We do have a future. You may have broken the bodies of the people of Omagh, but you can never break their spirit. The last line of one of my favourite songs is God is watching us from a distance. You can run, but you cannot hide." 1 week after the bombing, a day of reflection was designated and held around the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Between 40,000 to 60,000 people flooded the streets of Omagh to show support for the people who had lost loved ones. Prayers were then said at 10 minutes past 3, at exactly the same time the bomb had gone off just 1 week prior, and then a minute's silence was observed. The vigil ended with one Catholic child and one Protestant child saying prayers of hope. But who was responsible for this blast? 3 days after the blast, the real IRA took responsibility for the bombing and apologised for killing the civilians. They also defended their actions, stating that they did not intend to take lives and that they gave clear instructions that the bomb was 300 to 400 yards away from the courthouse, and at no time had they said it was placed near the courthouse. The transcripts of the actual phone calls show that their claims after the bombing are untrue. The RUC were then tasked with finding out exactly what happened on the day. RUC officer Ronnie Flanagan believes that the real IRA's claim is completely untrue, saying, "I can come to no other conclusion in that this was absolutely deliberate. We've had success in the past, either through intercepting these vehicles before they arrive at their intended destination, or reaching them very soon after they've arrived, so that we've been able to disrupt them. And I have no doubt that these people decided to give deliberately vague and misleading warnings to prevent us disrupting the explosive devices. I can come to no conclusion other than these people intended the bloody murder that resulted from their actions." The Northern Ireland Secretary, Mo Molam, described their apology as a pathetic attempt to apologise for and excuse mass murder. Just under a month after the bombing, the real IRA announced an immediate ceasefire of all their activities, which was to last for 2 years before they resumed them again. Though the real IRA claimed responsibility at the time, 10 years later, in 2008, a spokesperson minimalised their involvement, saying that the group, quote, "had minimal involvement in Omagh. Our code word was used. Nothing more. To have stated this at the time would have been lost in an understandable wave of emotion. Omagh was an absolute tragedy. Any loss of civilian life is regrettable. No one in any army, except perhaps the American or Israeli forces, wants to kill civilians. But wars don't end because civilians die in them." Both the British and Irish governments were quick to respond to the attack, introducing much tougher anti-terrorism laws, which could make it easier for them to arrest anyone they suspected of carrying out acts of terrorism. It also made the giving out of information to terrorists an arrestable offence. The police investigation into the bombing began immediately, and this would become the largest murder investigation in the history of Northern Ireland. Chief Superintendent Eric Anderson said, "We are facing an enormous task requiring meticulous examination of literally tons of rubble. This additional help represents a very significant increase in our ability to extract as quickly as humanly possible every last piece of evidence in what is a very complex jigsaw." In this quote, he is referring to London's Metropolitan Police, who were called in to assist in the investigation. Suspicion immediately fell on the real IRA, as a number of vehicles with bombs in them had been intercepted by Irish and Northern Irish police in the months preceding this attack. So they knew the real IRA were running an active bombing campaign. They also found some useful information after sifting through 8 tons of rubble. They found the detonator that had been hidden in a child's lunchbox. They also found the explosion was triggered by a Kupitan mechanical timer, which was the same type of timer that had been used in previous real IRA attacks. The 2 telephone booths that were used to call in the warnings were removed and forensically examined. The police also appealed to the public for help. 19 people were arrested and questioned, but in the end all were released. Though the police had a number of suspects, they had a very difficult time finding any proof linking them to the attacks, and soon months turned into years before anyone would be charged with the bombings. On the 9th of October 2000, the BBC aired a panorama episode titled "Who Bombed Omagh?" The show alleged that police on both sides of the border knew the identity of the bombers, but didn't have enough evidence to convict them. The show went on to say that the bomb car and scout car communicated by mobile while driving towards Omagh. By using these phone records, the police had enough information to identify the suspects. This information was too circumstantial and coincidental to be used in court, so the names of the 4 men were leaked to the BBC, who then named them on the programme Panorama. This naming of the suspects caused a huge amount of controversy when the show was aired. Some relatives of the victims sought to block it being aired, arguing that media justice was not actual justice. Other relatives of victims welcomed it, in the wake of a lack of actual prosecution by the police force. 1 year after the programme was aired, the BBC television centre in London was bombed, and the police believed that the bombing was in response to this documentary. In the same year that the programme aired, the families of 4 children killed in the Omagh bombing launched a civil action against the men named in the BBC programme. Then, 1 year on, the families of all 29 victims launched a £2 million civil action against the 5 real IRA suspects. This civil action concluded in 2009 with Michael McKevitt, Liam Campbell, Colin Murphy and Seamus Daly being found to have been liable for the bombing. Though a form of justice was found in the civil court, which relies on a lower burden of proof, in a criminal court things were very different. The first man to be charged in relation to the bombing was Colin Murphy, who was a builder and publican from the Irish county of Louth. He was charged with conspiring to cause an explosion. In court, it was heard that Murphy supplied 2 mobile phones that were used during the bombing. He was convicted in 2002 and sentenced to 14 years in prison, with the judge describing him as a long-time Republican extremist. 3 years later, in 2005, his conviction was overturned and a retrial was ordered on the basis that 2 Gardaí had falsified interview notes, and that Murphy's past history of dissident activity was improperly taken into account by the judges. He was eventually acquitted after spending 3 years behind bars. Also in 2005, Sean Hoey, who was a nephew of Colin Murphy, was formally charged with the murder of 29 people, as well as terrorism and explosive charges. The trial lasted for 10 months before he was cleared of all charges, with the judge criticising police witnesses for deliberate and calculated deception during the trial. By 2008, the idea that anyone would be convicted of the bombing was slim to none, and former Chief Constable Ronnie Flanagan made an apology to the victims' families. BBC reporter Kevin Connolly said of the families, quote, "The Omagh families were dignified in defeat, as they've been dignified at every stage of their fight for justice. Their campaigning will go on, but the prospect is surely receding now that anyone will ever be convicted of murdering their husbands and brothers and sisters and wives and children." In 2014, Seamus Daly was the last person to be charged with the murder of 29 people in Omagh, but this case was withdrawn 2 years later, after the Public Prosecution Service declared that there was no reasonable prospect of prosecution. The police ombudsman, Nuala O'Lone, released a report in 2001 that heavily criticised the RUC police force on their handling of the bombing and subsequent investigation. It stated that they ignored previous warnings and then failed to act when they had crucial intelligence. Representatives of the RUC completely disagreed with these findings and sought to block them from public release. Things got even more convoluted when it was revealed that a number of double agents had been working undercover within the real IRA at the time of the bombing. The American agency, the FBI, had an undercover agent who had infiltrated the real IRA. David Rupert was an agent working for the FBI and would routinely send them information in the form of encrypted emails. In the case of Omagh, he sent an email to his handler 4 days before the bombing, telling them the real IRA was planning a bombing attack in Omagh or Derry. It is unclear if this information was then passed on to the RUC. Then, the Gardaí in Ireland had an agent called Paddy Dixon who stole cars for the real IRA. Dixon was the one who stole the maroon Vauxhall that was used in the Omagh bombings, and he immediately told his handler of the incident, who then passed the information up the chain of command to Detective Chief Superintendent Dermot Jennings. It is then alleged that the Gardaí said, referring to the car with the bomb inside, "I think we will let this one go through." They were allowing the car to pass into Northern Ireland because they wanted to preserve Dixon as an agent and believed that the real IRA didn't pose much of a threat, as their previous bombings had only caused property damage. Finally, a second BBC documentary revealed some information about the UK Government Communications Headquarters, which is an intelligence gathering agency. They had intercepted and recorded 9 mobile phone exchanges between those allegedly responsible for the bombing. It is then alleged that they picked up some crucial sentences, which included one saying, "The bricks are in the wall," which is code, meaning that the bomb has been placed. It seems like the full extent of the information they received was never passed on to the RUC. One BBC journalist has even claimed that there was a covert listening device found inside the car that was used in the bombing, though this claim has never been proven. A report in 2013 found that the Irish, British and American agencies essentially starved the Northern Irish police force of intelligence that could have prevented this bombing. As of writing, it is unlikely that any further trials will be held, and that justice will be found for the victims of the Omagh bombing. On August 15, 2008, a memorial service was held in the town of Omagh to commemorate 20 years since the bombing. This service was boycotted by some victims' families, who believed that the local council, who were mostly comprised of Sinn Féin members, would not acknowledge that Republicans were responsible for the bombings. They had their own commemoration the following Sunday. Poet Brian Friel wrote this poem about the attacks in Omagh. One Saturday in Omagh in busy Market Street, where locals and shoppers would regularly meet. They talked and laughed about things in the past. Then suddenly they were silenced by a deafening blast. Concrete and glass spilled onto the street, and innocent people fell to their feet. Water pipes burst, so started to flood, and those who talked and laughed were covered in blood. Emergency services were there straight away to help injured people on that tragic day, and those who helped were courageous and brave. They were 29 people whom they could not save. Families cried as their dead had been named. Others were traumatised, injured and maimed. The people who lived there were terrified and shocked as the centre of Omagh was violently rocked. How much is enough and where will it end? The killing of innocent families and friends. Look at the damage, what have they done? A mother weeps for her dying son. This is the violence which everyone loathes. The dead only want to buy food or clothes. Some went with friends and others went alone. Those 29 people are not coming home. Put aside your differences, hatred and fears, for the people of Omagh as they cry endless tears. Our sympathies are with you and we pray for peace in our province and violence to go away.